My mother's voice cracked, not with sadness, but with a sharp, piercing greed. "That money belongs to me," she hissed, her face inches from mine. I didn't flinch. I just felt the cold weight of the legal envelope in my hand. "The will says otherwise, Mom," I replied, my voice as steady as a surgeon's. She threw her phone across the table, the screen shattering like a gunshot against the hardwood. But I didn't even blink. I just looked at the 7-figure balance on the paper and knew the fight had just begun. 2 years ago, my mother inherited $1 million from my father's life insurance. In 24 months, she spent every single cent on luxury vacations, designer bags, and trivial nonsense. Now, my grandparents have passed away, leaving the bulk of their estate to me and my disabled sister. My mother was left $20,000. Her response? She demanded we hand over our entire inheritance to her. She called me selfish for following my grandparents' dying wish. She thinks she can manipulate my sister, but she forgot one thing. I have the records. If you were in my shoes, would you give up your future to fund a mother's greed, or would you stand your ground? What would you do? If you were in my situation, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would give her the money because she's family. Type 2 or B if you would protect the inheritance and cut her off. Leave your comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now, because what I'm about to reveal next changed everything. The air in my grandparents' living room was thick, tasting of old mahogany and the faint, lingering scent of my grandmother's lavender perfume. It was a room designed for comfort, yet as we sat there, it felt like a courtroom. My mother sat on the velvet armchair, her spine rigid, her fingers twitching against her designer handbag, a handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. My sister Sarah sat next to me on the sofa. At 19, she looked small, her eyes darting nervously between my mother and the man sitting across from us. That man was my Uncle Marcus. He was the executor of the estate, a man who dealt in facts, figures, and finalities. He didn't look up as he adjusted his glasses. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the crisp, clinical rustle of legal bond paper. "Shall we begin?" Marcus asked. His voice was flat, devoid of the mourning I expected. I nodded once. My hands were folded in my lap, perfectly still. I had spent the last 48 hours preparing for this moment, not with tears, but with a mental spreadsheet. I knew the numbers. I knew the history, and I knew my mother. Marcus cleared his throat and began to read. The legal jargon drifted through the room like a fog until he reached the section that mattered: the distribution of assets. "To my daughter, Elena," Marcus read, glancing briefly at my mother, "I leave the sum of $20,000 cash." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I watched my mother's knuckles turn white as she gripped her bag. $20,000. To her, it was a rounding error. To her, it was an insult. Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "The remainder of the estate, including the primary residence on Oak Street and the investment portfolio valued at approximately $1,482,000, is to be divided equally between my granddaughters." I felt Sarah's breath hitch beside me. She reached for my hand, her palms sweaty and shaking. I squeezed it back, but my eyes remained fixed on my mother. I didn't look for grief on her face. I looked for the shift, and it happened almost instantly. The shock vanished, replaced by a dark, simmering heat. Her breathing became audible, short, jagged bursts of air. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at me. "There must be a mistake," she said. Her voice was low, vibrating with a forced restraint that I knew wouldn't last. My parents wouldn't do that. They knew I was the one who looked after them. They knew I needed the stability after what happened to your father. "The will is witnessed and notarized, Elena," Marcus replied, sliding the document across the coffee table. "It was updated 18 months ago. It is quite specific." My mother didn't reach for the paper. She stood up, her shadow falling over the table like a shroud. She looked at Sarah, then back to me, her eyes narrowing into slits. "You aren't actually going to keep it," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was an order. "You know that money belongs to me. You're 29, you have a career. And Sarah isn't capable of managing that kind of responsibility. You will both sign your portions over to me. It's the only right thing to do for this family." I looked at her, my expression a mask of professional indifference. I thought about the $1 million she had already burned through from my father's life insurance in less than 2 years. I thought about the luxury cruises and the investments that never materialized. "The will says otherwise, Mom," I said. My voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in her eyes. "And for once, we are going to follow the instructions exactly as they were written." My mother didn't scream. Not at first. Instead, she let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like air escaping a punctured tire. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of the mahogany coffee table. Her manicured nails, a deep shade of crimson, pressed so hard into the wood that the tips turned white. I watched the clock on the mantel. 5 seconds of silence. 10 seconds. I could hear the faint, metallic clinking of my Uncle Marcus's cufflink as he adjusted his posture, clearly uncomfortable with the rising mercury in the room. "You're being cold," my mother whispered. Her voice was thin, trembling with a calculated fragility that I had seen 1,000 times before. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with the kind of tears that only appear when she isn't getting exactly what she wants. "After everything I've sacrificed for this family, after the way I stayed by your father's side until his last breath, you would treat me like a stranger? Like a beggar at your gate?" I didn't blink. I didn't reach for a tissue to offer her. I simply leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, feeling the smooth fabric of my trousers. "Sacrifice is a heavy word, Mom," I said. My voice was level, almost monotonous. "But we aren't talking about the past. We are talking about a legal document. My grandparents were very clear about their intentions. They saw how things were handled 2 years ago." The mention of 2 years ago hit her like a physical blow. Her face tightened, the mask of the grieving widow slipping just enough to show the jagged edges of her resentment. 2 years ago, when my father died, the life insurance policy paid out exactly $1 million. At the time, I was grieving, and my sister Sarah was struggling with the onset of her health complications that made full-time work impossible. We trusted our mother. We didn't ask for a cent. We assumed that $1 million would provide a lifetime of security for her and a safety net for Sarah. Instead, I watched a masterclass in financial self-destruction. I had the records. I had secretly kept a folder of the bank statements I'd seen on her desk during my visits. $42,000 on a 3-week European cruise she took alone to find herself. $18,000 on a designer wardrobe she rarely wore. A series of loans to friends who vanished the moment the checks cleared. In 24 months, the 7-figure balance had dwindled to nearly zero. The house was falling into disrepair, and the luxury SUV in the driveway was her only remaining trophy of a fortune she had set on fire. "That was different," she snapped, her voice finally losing its soft edge. "I was in pain. I was trying to fill a void your father left behind. How dare you judge me for trying to survive?" "I'm not judging you," I replied, though we both knew that was a lie. "I'm looking at the data. You were given $1 million to secure your future. You spent it. Now my grandparents have left me and Sarah the means to secure ours. Sarah needs this. She can't work a 40-hour week, Mom. This money is her survival. It's her medical care, her housing, her life." My mother turned her gaze to Sarah. Sarah flinched, her eyes dropping to her lap. She was 19, soft-hearted, and had spent her whole life being told that Mom knew best. I could see the internal struggle on her face, the urge to please, the fear of being the bad daughter. "Sarah, honey," my mother said, her voice dropping back into that sweet, manipulative honey tone. "You know I would never let anything happen to you. If I have the money, I can take care of you. We can live together. We can be a real family again. You don't want to be selfish like your sister, do you? You don't want to see your own mother struggling to pay for groceries while you sit on a pile of cash?" The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. "Groceries?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through her performance. "You were left $20,000 today. That's enough for several years of groceries if you manage it correctly, but we both know that isn't what this is about." My mother stood up abruptly. The heavy velvet chair screeched against the floor, a jarring, grating sound that made Sarah jump. "I am the mother," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I am the head of this household. This money isn't yours. It was never meant for you. My parents were old and confused when they wrote that update. They didn't know what they were doing." "They were perfectly lucid, Elena," Marcus interjected, his voice weary. "I was there. They knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to ensure the girls were protected from certain habits." My mother whirled around to face him, her face flushed a deep, angry purple. "You've always hated me, Marcus. You've poisoned their minds against me from the start." She turned back to me, her breath coming in heavy, ragged gulps. "Fine. If this is how you want to play it, if you want to rob your own mother, then don't expect me to be there when your life falls apart. You are a cold, calculating thief. And you," she looked at Sarah, "you are just as bad if you let her lead you down this path." She grabbed her handbag, the gold chain rattling loudly in the tense silence. "I'm giving you 24 hours to reconsider," she said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Sign the documents, or consider yourselves daughterless. I won't be treated like a guest in my own family's legacy." She marched toward the door. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with a thud that echoed through the entire house, vibrating the glass in the windows. In the silence that followed, Sarah started to sob, the quiet, rhythmic sound of a broken heart. I didn't move. I didn't go to comfort her yet. I just looked at the copy of the will sitting on the table, $1,482,000. It was a lot of money, but I knew, looking at my sister's shaking shoulders, that it wouldn't be enough to pay for the war my mother had just declared. The echo of the door slamming felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. In the sudden vacuum-like silence that followed, the only sound was Sarah's ragged breathing. She was hunched over, her hands clutching her knees, her shoulders shaking with the kind of rhythmic, silent sobbing that always preceded one of her flare-ups. I didn't reach out to touch her yet. I knew from experience that in this state, any physical contact felt like an intrusion. "She's right, isn't she?" Sarah choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm selfish. We're being horrible. She's our mother, and she has nothing left." I looked at my sister, then at the empty space where our mother had just been standing. "She doesn't have nothing, Sarah. She has $20,000 and a house she chose to neglect. What she doesn't have is the $1 million she threw away." I closed my eyes for a moment, and the ghost of that first check appeared behind my eyelids. 2 years ago, the living room had looked exactly the same, but the atmosphere had been different. We were drowning in the raw, suffocating grief of losing our father. Then came the insurance payout, $1 million paid out in a single lump sum check. I remember the way the paper felt between my fingers, crisp, heavy, and smelling faintly of ink and promise. I had handed it to my mother without a second thought. I believed her when she said she would be the steward of our family's future, but grief is a convenient excuse for greed. The spending started 3 weeks after the funeral. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, systematic dismantling of a fortune. First, it was the healing trip. My mother claimed she couldn't breathe in the house my father had built, so she booked a 3-week luxury Mediterranean cruise. Cost, $42,860. She didn't invite us. She said she needed solitude. She returned with a suitcase full of designer labels and a new, frantic energy. Over the next 6 months, the driveway became a rotating showroom. The reliable family sedan was traded for a top-of-the-line Range Rover, $95,000. Then came the home improvements that were never finished. A $20,000 deposit on a kitchen remodel that she canceled halfway through because she didn't like the contractor's aura. The contractor kept the deposit. My mother didn't care. I sat there watching Sarah cry, and I felt the cold, clinical anger rising in my throat. While my mother was buying $5,000 handbags to fill the void, I was the one working overtime to pay for Sarah's physical therapy. I was the one negotiating with insurance companies when Sarah's specialized medication wasn't covered. When I asked my mother for help with Sarah's bills, she would sigh, touch her expensive pearls, and tell me that money was tight and that I needed to be more self-sufficient. The math was simple, and the math was devastating. By the end of year one, $600,000 was gone. By the end of year two, the accounts were effectively hollowed out. She hadn't invested a cent. She hadn't saved for Sarah's long-term care. She had simply consumed it. "She's not broke because of bad luck, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. "She's broke because she treated $1 million like pocket change while you were struggling to walk. She had her chance to be the mother she's claiming to be. She failed." Uncle Marcus finally moved. He leaned forward, his chair creaking softly, and picked up the heavy legal envelope. He looked at me, his eyes tired but sharp. "Your mother is right about one thing," Marcus said, his voice low. "She won't stop. She's already spent that $20,000 in her head, and she's already looking at your inheritance as her next line of credit. She's going to use every emotional weapon she has." "I know," I replied. I reached out and finally placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. She was still shaking, but the sobbing had slowed. "But this time the vault is closed. I'm not letting her burn Sarah's future to buy another cruise." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "But she said she'd disown us. She said we aren't her daughters anymore." "Let her," I said. It was a cold thought, but it was a necessary one. A mother who demands her disabled daughter's survival fund isn't a mother. She's a predator, and I've spent the last 2 years learning how to deal with those. I stood up and walked over to the window, watching my mother's luxury SUV peel out of the driveway, the tires screeching against the asphalt. She thought she had 24 hours to break us. She didn't realize that I had been counting every cent she spent for 730 days. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was an auditor. The house felt like a hollowed-out shell after Uncle Marcus left. I had stayed behind to help Sarah into bed, her joints stiffening from the stress of the afternoon. By 9 p.m., I was in the kitchen, the only sound being the low, rhythmic hum of the dishwasher and the occasional rattle of a loose window pane in the wind. I was staring at my laptop screen, a spreadsheet open, calculating the exact tax implications of the inheritance. $1,482,000 divided by 2, $741,000 each. Then I heard it. The soft, metallic click of the front door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mother still had her spare key. I heard her footsteps, slow, deliberate, and quiet, moving toward Sarah's bedroom on the first floor. She didn't call out for me. She didn't turn on the hallway lights. She was hunting in the dark. I stood up, my movements silent, and padded down the hallway. I stopped just outside the cracked door of Sarah's room. The air coming from the doorway felt cold. Inside, the only light came from Sarah's small bedside lamp, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. My mother was sitting on the edge of the bed. She had changed out of her sharp blazer into a soft, oversized sweater, her gentle mother costume. She was holding Sarah's hand, stroking it with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. "You know I love you more than anything, Sarah," my mother whispered. Her voice was a low, vibrating hum, designed to soothe and then smother. "Your sister. She's always been different. Hard, cold. She doesn't understand what it's like for us. She has her career, her health, her independence. She looks at you and sees a burden she has to manage. But I look at you and I see my baby." I saw Sarah's silhouette shift. She was sitting up, her back against the headboard, looking small and fragile. "She doesn't think I'm a burden, Mom. She's the one who takes me to my appointments." "For now," my mother countered, her voice sharpening just a fraction. "But for how long? Until she gets tired? Until she wants to move away and leave you in some state-run facility? You can't work a full-time job, honey. You know that. Your medical bills for last quarter alone were $4,822. That inheritance money, it's a lot, but in your hands, it's a target. People will take advantage of you. Your sister will control it. She'll put it in a trust you can't touch. You'll have to beg her for every cent." Sarah's voice was trembling now. "She said it was for my future." "I am your future," my mother hissed, leaning closer. The shadow of her head swallowed Sarah's face. "If you sign your portion over to me, I can buy us a smaller, accessible house. Just us. I'll be your full-time caregiver. You won't ever have to worry about a bill again. I'll handle the bank, the lawyers, everything. Don't you want to be safe? Don't you want to be loved by someone who doesn't look at you like a line item on a budget?" I watched Sarah's hand tighten around the edge of her blanket. The manipulation was masterful. My mother was weaponizing Sarah's greatest fear, abandonment, and pairing it with the very financial insecurity she herself had created. I don't know," Sarah stammered. "I'd have to talk to her." "No," my mother interrupted, her grip on Sarah's hand tightening. I could see the tension in her arm. "If you tell her, she'll bully you. She'll use those big words and those legal papers to confuse you. She's already turned Uncle Marcus against me. You're the only one left who can fix this family. Just one signature, Sarah. That's all it takes to bring us back together. Otherwise, I don't know if I can stay here and watch you two destroy yourselves. I might have to leave, for my own mental health." The ultimatum was out. Sign over the $741,000 or lose your mother forever. I stepped into the light of the doorway. "The front door was locked for a reason, Mother," I said. My voice was flat, echoing in the small room. My mother didn't jump. She didn't even look surprised. She slowly turned her head, her eyes catching the lamplight like a predator in the brush. She didn't let go of Sarah's hand. "I was just comforting my daughter," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Something you wouldn't understand." "I understand predatory lending," I replied, walking into the room. I stood at the foot of the bed, looking down at the two of them. "And I understand emotional extortion. Sarah, did she tell you that the $4,000 in medical bills last month were paid by me because she claimed she was short while buying a new set of luggage?" "That's a lie," my mother snapped, standing up. The gentle mother costume was shredded in an instant. "I have the bank transfers," I said, my pulse steady, my hands resting at my sides. "Transaction number 8904, sent from my savings to your account, which you then used to pay the clinic. You took the credit for the payment, but it was my money. My sister's health isn't a bargaining chip for your next vacation." I looked at Sarah, whose face was pale, her eyes darting between us. "She's asking you to give up your life security so she can continue a lifestyle she didn't earn. If you sign that paper, Sarah, you aren't saving the family. You're funding its destruction." My mother took a step toward me, her face inches from mine. I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. "You think you're so smart," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you've won because of a piece of paper. But you're alone. You've always been alone." "I'd rather be alone with my integrity," I said, "than a thief with an audience. It's time for you to leave. If you enter this house without an invitation again, I'm changing the locks and calling the police. I don't care if you're my mother. I care that you're a threat." My mother looked at me, then at Sarah, who was now crying silently, her head buried in her hands. With a sharp, guttural sound of disgust, my mother grabbed her purse and marched out of the room. I waited until I heard the front door slam for the second time that day. Only then did I sit on the bed and reach for Sarah, but as I touched her arm, she pulled away. "You made her leave," Sarah sobbed. "You made her hate us." I looked at my sister, and for the first time that day, I felt a flicker of fatigue. The money was safe, but the cost was rising. "No, Sarah," I said softly. "She made her choice 2 years ago. I'm just the one making sure she lives with it." The next morning, the air in my grandparents' study was frigid. I had met Uncle Marcus there at 7 a.m. before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The room smelled of cedar and the sharp ozone scent of a laser printer. On the desk sat a stack of bank statements, tax returns, and legal folders, organized with the kind of obsessive precision my grandfather was known for. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a ledger. "Your mother has been calling me all night," Marcus said, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. He didn't look up from a spreadsheet. "She's threatening a lawsuit. She claims undue influence and mental incapacity regarding your grandfather's final update to the will." "She can claim whatever she wants," I replied. I was sitting in my grandfather's leather chair, my posture perfect, my laptop open. But the medical records from his final year show he was as sharp as a razor. What I'm interested in is the why, Marcus. Why did he leave her exactly $20,000? It's a specific number? It's a pointed number. Marcus paused, his pen hovering over a document. He looked at me, his eyes tired but searching. "He knew her, Elena, better than you think. He saw the way she handled your father's insurance. He told me once that giving her $1 million was like pouring water into a sieve." For 3 hours, we worked in total silence. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic clicking of my mouse and the crisp snap of Marcus turning pages. We were looking for the missing piece, the evidence that would strip my mother of her victim narrative. At 10:42 a.m., Marcus stopped. I heard him exhale a long, slow breath. "I found it," he whispered. He slid a weathered blue manila envelope across the desk. Inside was a single handwritten letter on my grandfather's personal stationery, dated August 14th, 2018. Attached to it was a copy of a wire transfer confirmation, transaction number 4421. I read the letter. My pulse didn't quicken. If anything, my heart rate slowed into a deep, icy calm. The letter was addressed to my mother. It stated in no uncertain terms that my grandfather was providing her with an early inheritance of $150,000 to help with debts and lifestyle adjustments following my father's passing. It explicitly mentioned that this sum was to be deducted from any future estate distribution. Beneath the letter was my mother's signature, bold, loopy, and unmistakable. "She already got her share," I said, my voice flat and clinical. "She took $150,000 4 years ago, spent it, and then stood in that living room yesterday and called us thieves for keeping what was left." "It's a secret weapon, Elena," Marcus said, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. "She thought this was a private gift. She didn't think he'd keep the receipt in the estate files." I stood up, taking the envelope and tucking it into my bag. I felt a strange sense of clarity. The emotional fog she had tried to create with her tears and her gentle mother act had evaporated. "She's coming over this afternoon for her answer," I said, checking my watch. "She thinks she's coming for a payday. She doesn't realize she's coming for an audit." I walked to the door, stopping for a moment to look at the empty chair where my grandfather used to sit. He had left me the money, but more importantly, he had left me the proof. "Marcus," I said, without turning around, "call the lawyer. I want this document digitized and encrypted. I don't want her to have a single shadow to hide in when I show this to the rest of the family." At 4 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a frantic buzz, but a slow, rhythmic press, the sound of a woman who believed she had already won. My mother walked into the living room, her face a mask of practiced serenity. She had traded her aggressive red lipstick for a soft, muted pink. She didn't look at me. She went straight to Sarah, who was sitting on the edge of the sofa, her fingers twisted into the fabric of her skirt. "I've brought the documents, Sarah," my mother said, her voice like velvet. She placed a single sheet of paper on the coffee table. It was a transfer of rights form. It's a simple signature, one stroke of the pen, and all of this tension, all of this ugliness, it just goes away. We can be a family again. No more lawyers, no more audits, just us. I sat in the armchair across from them, the blue manila envelope resting on my lap. I could feel the weight of the document inside, transaction 4421. I watched my sister's hand reach for the silver pen my mother had placed alongside the paper. Sarah looked at me, her eyes pleading for a reason to stop, or perhaps a reason to give in. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint, metallic ticking of my mother's watch. She leaned in, her shadow falling over the document. "Do it for us, Sarah," she whispered. "Don't let her bitterness destroy our future." If you were in my situation, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would let your sister sign and walk away to find your own peace. Type 2 or B if you would open the envelope and expose the truth right now. Leave your comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now, because what I'm about to reveal next changed everything. I didn't wait for Sarah to touch the pen. I cleared my throat, the sound sharp and clinical in the stagnant air. "Before anyone signs anything," I said, my voice cutting through my mother's whisper like a blade, "we need to talk about the $150,000 you've already spent, Mom." My mother froze. Her hand, which had been hovering near Sarah's shoulder, twitched. She slowly turned her head toward me, the mask of the gentle mother cracking to reveal the cold, hard desperation underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "You're making things up again to confuse your sister." "Transaction 4421, I replied, sliding the blue envelope onto the table, covering her transfer form. "August 14th, 2018. A private wire transfer from grandfather to you. He called it an early inheritance. And he kept the receipt." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the eardrums like deep sea pressure. My mother didn't move. She didn't blink. The blood drained from her face so completely that her skin took on a gray, parchment-like quality. Her hand, still hovering near the transfer form, began to tremble, a fine, rhythmic vibration that rattled the silver pen against the mahogany table. That was a gift," she finally whispered. Her voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its manipulative warmth. "My father gave me that money to help with the funeral costs and the transition. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a father helping his grieving daughter." "August 14th, 2018, I said, my voice flat and clinical. I didn't look at her face. I looked at the document. "The funeral was in June. The transition, as you call it, was already over. This transfer, transaction 4421, was moved into a private offshore account you opened 2 days prior, an account you never mentioned to the estate lawyers." I flipped the page, revealing the handwritten letter. I pointed to the third paragraph, where my grandfather's shaky but firm script was unmistakable. "Read the highlighted section, Mom," I said. "It says this sum of $150,000 is an advance on your portion of my estate. It is to be deducted from any future distribution to ensure fairness between my heirs." And right below that is your signature, dated, witnessed, and notarized. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide as she scanned the page. I saw the moment the realization hit her. The guilt that had been crushing her shoulders for the last 24 hours vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at our mother, not with love or fear, but with the stunned disbelief of someone seeing a stranger for the first time. "You knew," Sarah whispered. "You knew you had already taken your share. You got $20,000 yesterday because you already spent $150,000 of the inheritance 4 years ago, and you still tried to take mine?" "I was protecting us," my mother suddenly shrieked, her composure shattering like dropped glass. She slammed her fist onto the table, making the tea saucers rattle. "I am 61 years old. I have nothing. You two have your whole lives ahead of you. What is a few $100,000 to you compared to my survival?" "It's not about survival, Elena," I said, using her first name for the first time in my life. The shift in address was like a physical barrier. "It's about $1 million of insurance money that vanished into luxury cruises and designer bags. It's about the fact that while you were sitting on a secret $150,000 nest egg, you let me pay for Sarah's surgeries. You watched me work 3 jobs while you bought a Range Rover." I stood up, slowly picking up the transfer form she had brought for Sarah to sign. I tore it once, twice, and then a third time. The sound of the paper ripping was the only noise in the room. "The audit is over," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than her scream. "You will take your $20,000. You will go back to your house. And if you ever mention my sister's money again, I will hand this entire file to the district attorney to investigate the non-disclosure of assets during the initial probate. Do you understand?" My mother looked at me, her mouth hanging open, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there were no more shadows to hide in. The light of the data was too bright. My mother's reaction followed a predictable, frantic pattern. First came the silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that lasted exactly 6 seconds. Then, the Darvo began. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. "You've been spying on me," she whispered, her voice trembling not with shame, but with a sharp, defensive venom. "You and Marcus, you've been digging through my private life like vultures. How long have you been holding this? How long have you been waiting to humiliate me in front of my own daughter?" She turned to Sarah, her eyes wide and wet. "Sarah, look at her. Look at how cold she is. She kept this secret just to trap me. She wants to tear this family apart over a piece of paper from 4 years ago. That money, it's gone, Sarah. It went to bills you don't even know about. It went to keeping a roof over our heads while your sister was busy building her perfect life." I didn't flinch. My pulse was a steady 64 beats per minute. I watched a bead of sweat roll down her temple, disappearing into the collar of her expensive sweater. "The roof was already paid for by Dad's insurance, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics like a scalpel. "The $150,000 wasn't for bills. It was for the lifestyle you couldn't afford but refused to give up. You aren't the victim of a trap. You're the victim of your own signature." "You are a monster," she shrieked, standing up so fast her chair screeched against the hardwood, a jarring, metallic sound that made Sarah wince. "You're treating your own mother like a criminal. I am an old woman with nothing. I am a widow with $20,000 to my name, and my 2 daughters are sitting on a fortune mocking me with receipts. Is this what my parents wanted? To see their daughter beggared by her own children?" She was pacing now, her breathing jagged and loud in the small room. She was trying to flip the narrative, to make her greed look like our cruelty. She wanted Sarah to feel the weight of her suffering, but I remained a statue. I wasn't an audience for her performance. I was the auditor of her lies. "The numbers don't have feelings, Mom," I said coldly. "And they don't care about your stories. You've had your share. This conversation is over." The air in the room didn't warm up, but the static of my mother's rage finally began to dissipate, leaving behind a cold, hollow silence. I didn't wait for her to sit back down. I reached into my bag and pulled out a final set of documents prepared by Uncle Marcus's legal team. I laid them on the table, overlapping the torn remains of her predatory contract. "Here is how this ends," I said. My voice was flat, a sharp contrast to her jagged breathing. "There will be no more private transfers. There will be no more loans for luxury trivialities. Sarah's share of the inheritance, exactly $741,000, is being moved into an irrevocable trust. I am the named trustee. Uncle Marcus is the secondary." My mother's eyes darted to the papers, her lips curling in a silent snarl. "You're locking her money away? You're controlling her just like I said you would." "I am protecting her from you," I corrected her, my gaze unwavering. "The trust will cover her medical expenses, her housing, and a structured monthly stipend. You will have 0 access to the principal. You will have 0 oversight of the distributions. You will receive your $20,000 from the estate via a certified check mailed to your residence. Not a penny more." I slid a pen toward her, not the silver one she had brought, but a simple plastic office pen. "If you attempt to contest the will, or if you continue to harass Sarah for her funds, transaction 4421 goes from a private file to a public record," I continued. "I will file a formal report for the non-disclosure of that $150,000 during the initial probate of Dad's estate. That's fraud, Mother, and the penalties for that far exceed the $20,000 you have left." She looked at the pen, then at me. For a moment, I saw the calculations running behind her eyes, the desperate search for a loophole, a weakness, a way to spin the narrative. But I had removed every variable. The numbers were locked. The legal boundaries were set. "Sign the acknowledgement of the trust terms," I said, "and we can end this day without involving the authorities." With a hand that shook with suppressed fury, she grabbed the pen. The sound of her signature scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room, a frantic, jagged sound that signaled the end of her reign. She slammed the pen down and stood up, her face a mask of bitter defeat. "You've won your numbers, Elena," she spat, her voice trembling. "I hope they keep you warm at night when you realize you have no mother left." "I haven't had a mother for 2 years," I replied, watching her walk toward the door. "I've had a debt collector, and today the account is closed." The front door closed with a click that was surprisingly quiet, yet it echoed through the hallway like a gavel hitting a bench. My mother was gone. The smell of her expensive perfume lingered in the air, a cloying, artificial sweetness that I immediately moved to neutralize by opening the window. A cool breeze swept in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. The static was gone. I turned back to Sarah. She was still sitting on the sofa, her hands resting flat on her lap. She looked exhausted, but the trembling had stopped. The confusion that had clouded her eyes for years had been replaced by a weary, sober understanding. "Is it really over?" she asked. Her voice was thin, but it didn't break. "The crisis is over," I replied, sitting down across from her. I didn't offer a hug. I offered the truth. "The money is being moved into the trust tomorrow morning. Exactly $741,214.78. It's yours, Sarah, but it's protected. From her, and even from your own heart when she tries to pull at it again." A week later, the atmosphere had shifted from volatile to clinical. Uncle Marcus called me from his office. He told me that after he formally presented my mother with the digitized copy of the 150,000 advance letter, her fire had simply gone out. Faced with the undeniable paper trail of her own greed, she had retreated into a simmering, entitled silence. She accepted the $20,000 check. She even offered a hollow apology, though we both knew it was a strategic move to keep a foot in the door for future family gatherings. I didn't care about the apology. I cared about the math. Sarah had made a major improvement. She agreed to match whatever boundaries I set. If I didn't give more than a small holiday gift, she wouldn't either. The cycle of emotional tax was broken. My mother was appeased only because she knew the vault was now made of legal steel and guarded by a daughter who couldn't be manipulated by tears. I took the original will and the blue manila envelope to my bank. I walked into the vault, the air cool and smelling of ozone and metal. I placed the documents into my safe deposit box, slot 402. As the heavy metal door clicked shut and I turned the key, I felt a profound sense of peace. It wasn't the warmth of a happy ending. It was the satisfaction of a balanced ledger. I walked out into the sunlight, my heart rate steady, my mind already moving on to the next task. I had saved my sister's future and honored my grandparents' legacy. I had learned that in the face of toxic entitlement, love is not enough. You need a witness, a lawyer, and a very long memory. My mother still calls sometimes, her voice dripping with that familiar entitled honey. I listen for exactly 3 minutes, then I politely hang up. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel angry. I feel nothing at all. And in this family, that silence is the greatest victory I've ever earned.